Welcome to the video on reflexive and intensifying pronouns in Latin. This is mostly for a Latin 2 class, perhaps a Latin 3 class is doing some review. It does assume that you know indirect statements and ACIs, so if you don't know those or your infinitive forms, make sure you take a look because some of my examples include those, which might be a hindrance to you, but there's also an easy example of each one, and you might be able to figure out what these things do without ACIs, but since one of them, the reflexive, takes such a prominent role in an ACI a lot of times, I figured we could kind of pair the two units together. So you're probably seeing this doing a unit on ACIs or a semester on ACIs. So should be some fun, and I'll move on to the next slide. I'll get started so as to not make this video for too long, but make sure to rewind if I talk too quickly and get an explanation again, or to email me with questions. Thanks. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is the reflexive. The reflexive is named such because it reflects back. In other words, it's like a mirror. It's going to reference the subject of the sentence, and usually that means the subject of the main sentence, which if you have an ACI, makes a little bit of makes sense a little bit because you're going to have a main clause and then a dependent clause that's going to reference that subject in the main clause. So just make sure you keep that in mind. They can be in the same clause as the thing it refers to. We're going to see two examples of that actually. But for forms, it's actually almost the same thing as your ego me, mihi me, tu, tui, tibi, te, te. And that is, it's ex, sui, sibi, say, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative. All right. And so check those out. The first example here, we have Narcissus say, tota corde amat. You start off with an easy example, that's the subject. Now, say is your accusative or ablative. It's likely not ablative. The reason is ablatives with pronouns like this are usually in prepositions. So there you go. Tota corde, agree, those are both ablative, and then we have amat here as a verb. And so the translation here, Narcissus loves himself with all his heart. Now you'll note, if I ask you what it refers to Narcissus, which is why you use the self here, because he's in the same clause. So Narcissus loves himself with all of his heart. So here, because it's in the same clause, you're translating it as himself, and it's referring back to the subject of the sentence, as I said before. This example over here, sine familia, seni sapiens, sibi. There's our reflexive. Fabulas longas narrat. All right, so without a family, the wise old man, narrat, he tells, direct object, long stories. Sibi here is dative, so to himself. It's kind of a sad sentence. But you get all of the normal dative stuff. You have a telling verb, it means to. You just have to put himself in there. So without a family, the wise old man tells long stories to himself. All right, so you have the himself thing down because in both examples we've referenced the subject, and they do something to themselves, and therefore the reflexive seems to make sense there because it refers to the subject of the sentence in the same clause. But let's take a look at one where it's not in the same clause. Here we have senatui, Scipio Africanus, and then se is our accusative. We don't have an ablative probably. Carthaginem is another accusative. And with this infinitive, I'm thinking this is an ACI. We have a nice future infinitive there. Et urbem, accusative, future infinitive yet again, and this, and we have naravit, our verb to tell again. So we have Scipio Africanus told to the Senate that. Nice ACI, that. Now, what do you do with the say? Well, it still refers to the subject of the sentence. It refers to Scipio Africanus. Okay? And so you can't say himself. You can't say Scipio Africanus told to the Senate that that himself. That doesn't make any sense. You have to use a he here because he's actually the subject of that clause. And therefore you need the nominative in English, he. So Scipio Africanus told to the Senate that he would sail to Carthage and would attack the city. But notice how it's he because it plays a different role than we're used to in the clause above. It's in a clause that's separate from the main clause, and it's the subject of that clause, so you need to use a he. So keep that in mind. You can have this thing not mean self, even though when it's in the same clause, it does mean like himself or themselves or herself. But it refers to whatever the subject is. Now note the form up here. It's a little unclear. I think that it's worth noting that these are both singular and plural. So if your subject is plural, say is plural. If the subject is singular, say is singular. Same with sibi, same with sui, all of them. So these are actually singular or plural. It all depends on the subject. And that way you have to use kind of the gender or animacy of the subject in order to know how to translate it. So it could be himself, it could be itself, it could be herself, it could be themselves. It could just be them or he if it's in a different clause like we did here. So keep that in mind, that this is going to, as long as it refers to the subject, it does whatever that case is warranting in that instance. All right, let's move on to the intensifying pronoun. All right, you'll note here the form is a bit different. It's given right here, ipsa, ipsa, ipsum. You'll note that these are not like the personal pronouns, but they're much more like the illa, illa, illud. So this one in the genitive is ipsius all the way across, ipsi all the way across, and then you get your ipsum, So it actually just follows normal patterns. But it's a lot like illa, illa, illud. If you think of it like that, then it'll work, except instead of illud, you have ipsum. But same forms, but it is a pronoun, so you do have these genitive and dative I things going on here. And then, of course, it has plural forms too, but they're pretty standard. iPad's having trouble. There we go. All right. And we can see some examples here for translation, but mostly you're going to use the himself, herself, or itself again. So you're going to use that self, but you'll see it's much more adjectival. And I'll show you in a second what that means. So dicatur caesarum ipsum. Notice the agreement there. This should be militibus. In proilio pugnavice. And because we had that ACI here, boom, we have an indirect statement. Because your accusative here, your infinitive here, you got a head verb here. So it is said that, and then this is where you're going to get the ipsum, it is said that Caesar himself fought with his soldiers in battle. So you'll notice he still says himself, but it's just more intensifying Caesar, showing that it was the person of Caesar, not like a representative of him who was fighting in the battle with the soldiers. And so the intensifying pronoun really latches onto that emphasis. Okay. And you can have this without agreeing with something. You could, if you get rid of Caesar here, you would have it is said that he himself. So you just use a he, you wouldn't use Caesar. But with the intensifying pronoun, you do need that first pronoun and then the self to make it more emphatic. You can't just make it sound like a reflexive, because it doesn't necessarily agree with the subject of the sentence at all. But in English, we have a problem because the self is used for multiple different things. So keep that in mind. Romani milites dixit, se Hannibalem ipsum cum elephantis vidice. All right, so we have the Roman soldiers. Oh man, this should be erunt. Anyway, Romani milites dixerunt, se Hannibalem ipsum cum elephantis vidice. So we have the Roman soldiers said that, and then look, an example of a reflexive, that they had seen Hannibal himself. All right. So you'll notice two things. One, se refers to the subject, Romani milites, so it's they here. And it's the subject of the ACI, which is why you can use a they, and you don't have to say themselves or anything like that. It's in a different clause. So the Roman soldiers said that they had seen Hannibal himself. It's more emphatic. See how it's modifying Hannibal? It's the emphatic self with elephants. Okay, so this intensifying pronoun you can see in ACIs. You can see it not in ACIs just fine. I just happened that both of these examples are in ACIs. But this is the intensifying self. So if you really want to point out that somebody did it personally, you would say like he or she themselves, he or himself, or she herself did a thing. So it's kind of an interesting concept. But anyway, glad to keep this video short, and I will see you next time. I hope this makes sense. Make sure to rewind if it doesn't.